So very good afternoon to everyone. My name is Siddharth, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to episode 3 of Data Privacy and Security webinar series, The Consent Equation, Power, Privacy, and Responsibility. In episode 2, inside the DPDP Act, we explored how the Act is changing governance, daily compliance, and how organizations can be ready for penalties. Today, we are taking the discussion forward by focusing on one of the most important pillars of privacy, which is consent management. We'll break down how consent is designed in the DPDP Act, what a consent management system really looks like, and how organizations can make their consent practices transparent, secure, and user first. We're thrilled to have Mr. Khatri, Mr. Ibrahim Khatri, founder, CEO of PrivEasy, who is also a certified privacy professional who has advised organizations globally on consent and compliance. Moderating today's session is Ms. Isha Oswal, CEO of CryptoBind, who continues to drive the conversation around building secure, trust-first digital ecosystems. So before we dive in, let's have a couple of quick polls. So I've shared my screen. The audience can participate in the chat. Right, so the right answer is 1 and 3 are truths and 2 is a lie. All right, thank you all for the response, and let's begin with the session.
Thank you, Siddharth. Hi, Ibrahim. Welcome to CryptoBind Digital Insights.
Thank you, Isha. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thank you for being there. And we are very excited to have a lot of knowledge from your side because I think to begin with, I mean, it's consent management has been something which is quite focused or everybody has a lot of questions around, and especially with a new BRD document. So before we move on to that, I think I have a question for you and just want to have your views on overall, DPDP Act and also about what's your take on the overall situation which is there today.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, we all have been waiting, anticipating for the DPDP Act to get the rules to get notified. Right now, it's almost been like a little over 2 years that the Act came into effect on 11th of Jan. And as we all know, the rules came out early this year. Industry feedback has also been given, and MeTs having some kind of snippets around certain areas like journalism and what have you. The good news is that I recently read that Mr. Vinayak Godse, who is the CEO of DSEI, said that rules should be notified by end of the year, right? So
yeah,
I think organizations should really start working on their DPDP compliance, right? Because as we all know, it's a journey. It's not something that happens overnight.
absolutely. That's right. So I think all said, what we say is, DPDP Act is getting very crucial. And with all of this, it begins with consent management. So when we talk about consent management, we all know that NETD has come up with a business requirement document to help organizations guide them in terms of the objectives and functionalities of the systems which will be designed in terms of meeting consent management in line with Digital Personal Data Protection Act, which is like DPDP Act. And since now the personal data protection is becoming increasingly critical, the organizations are facing challenges in terms of managing consents transparently and effectively, as well as keeping intact in terms of the regulatory compliance. So when we talk about or look at all of this, I think my first question to you would be, what is the purpose of this business requirement document for CMS, that is consent management system?
It's a great question. And before I answer that question, I'll just take a step back, right? And just would like to highlight that, in my previous life, before I started PrivEasy a couple of years back, I was with EY back in 2017, and I had the opportunity to be the data protection officer for some of the largest banks in the Middle East, where we implemented the GDPR program. And, consent is very unique in India compared to the other global regulations such as GDPR, which is considered the Bible of any privacy regulation. They have something called as a legitimate use, right, where they can use a customers or employees' data for certain legitimate uses, which is not the case in India. In India, uh, one of the roundtables with Meeti, there was a discussion that there's probably going to be a consent fatigue because you are going to need explicit consent from your customers and your employees, which is unlike GDPR, right? GDPR can rely on legitimate interest, legitimate uses of data processing, based on certain criteria like execution of a contract or what have you. But in India, we need explicit, granular, clear consent from customers, right? So
That's right.
so that's going to be an interesting area, right? Because a lot of organizations that basically think that they are compliant with GDPR and they will automatically get compliant with DPDP will not be the case, right? Because consent management is very unique in India right now. The workflows and explicit consent requirements are pretty unique.
Okay.
So to answer your question, right, there are about 3 or 4 broad areas. What is the purpose of this BRD document? Is basically to design a consent management system which will be registered in by the government, right? It has some registration requirements, and the scope and objective is basically it defines the lawful basis of the personal data that is being collected, PII element that is collected, and which systems should basically should be integrated with the consent management system, right? There are other functional modules, right, that should basically encompass a consent management system, which will be your consent capture screens, your explicit preference centers given to your customers, dashboards, right? And also API for validation with like your auditors and testers and developers as well in a single source of truth. Yeah. There are also like non-functional requirements, which are like security and availability, which are very clearly defined in the BRD document, right?
Okay. Yeah, I think that sets the purpose why BRD document exists or why it had to come in existence while explaining more about consent management system. So while we talk about this, I've also read that it talks more about key stages. There are multiple stages which consent management has. So if you talk about it, what are those key stages of the consent management life cycle outline? So there is a life cycle which has been outlined in the document. So what are those key stages of this life cycle which are outlined in the BRD?
Yeah, so consent is, I mean, specifically consent from a DPDP perspective, and the BRD takes care of the complete life cycle, right? And there are, if I may say, there are about 5 stages for the whole consent life cycle. One is the consent capture, which is the initial stage where the user gives consent for a clearly defined purpose. Why is he giving consent, right? Then the second step would be your consent validation, right? Why, which validates the consent is captured correctly before it starts processing. So first is collection, and then comes your validation. Then comes your updation, right? Because if a user for any reason wants to basically change and update their consent preference, they should be able to do that from the preference center, right? And that should be enforced, that should be triggered and enforced to all systems and processors accordingly. Consent renewal also is an important aspect, which is I think the 4th aspect, which basically talks about consent, which is time bound, right? If it has a time expiry and what have you, then consent renewal becomes extremely important there, right? Or if the purpose changes, right, then also it triggers a renewal. And finally, the 5th stage is your consent withdrawal, right? If a data principal decides that they don't want to be processed any further, then they can basically withdraw their consent if there is no legal binding for the customer or employee in that case.
Right. Okay, so I think it's quite detailed outline. So somewhere initially in the act, of course, it talks about consent management. It talks about a lot of aspects around the consent management. But I think these stages gives very clear idea in terms of what are the stages which needs to be considered while they set up CMS. So when we talk about, all of these, the first stage in terms of consent is consent collection. So the biggest question which may come to mind for a lot of people is how does this CMS ensure that the consent collection which is happening is both explicit and the purpose specific as it is required by DPDP Act?
Yeah, so that's again great question, right? So the CMS, the consent management system, should have a, and the BRD basically defines that it should have a great taxonomy. So a purpose ID should basically be tagged with a processing purpose, right? And this should basically, this purpose ID, right, should basically travel across the consent record should basically travel with this ID to all the systems uniformly, right? So a consent is updated not only in one place, but becomes universally, a customer can give consent in one place, which is the dashboard, and then it should reflect in all downstream systems as well, right? For this, the user interface should basically map with the purpose ID to avoid any misalignment, right? So purpose ID will map with all the downstream systems and the customer's consent that they have given. Um, the another very important aspect of what you basically touched upon from explicit and non-explicit side is that consent records should basically be maintained by every CMS, right? And immutable. I think we'll cover that in detail a bit later. But consent records should basically be tracked, logged in an immutable format, and there should be audit logs as well, right? Because there will be, especially for significant data fiduciaries, they will have to show their accountability to the regulator, and hence audit logs are extremely important. And then the retention rules, right? That how long are you keeping this data for? Because as per DPDP, you cannot keep data of a customer more than the if the purpose has expired, right? Like if the account has closed, keeping in mind the other kind of regulations, explicitity basically comes into effect.
Yeah, right. I think this gives kind of summary on the purpose of the BRD, why does it exist, what it talks about, the stages around the life cycle of the consent management, and the most important and critical thing which you just explained about consent being explicit or with a purpose ID. So purpose ID I think is a very interesting thing which has come up or which is defined and which is going to actually solve a major question which probably lot of these DPOs, even if they've done their DPO, but I'm sure they have a great understanding on the act. But when it comes to actual implementation or execution, these are few minute questions which they will have, and we have touched upon that. So I'm sure this would have helped our audience to understand a little more in detail. So when we talk about all of this, there is one more important thing which I have understood is a lot of modules which are defined by CMS. So, on behalf of our audience, I think we'll like to explore on how different modules within the CMS deliver compliance, security, as well as transparency to all the stakeholders. So, to talk about it, I think I would like to have a question for you that according to this BRD, what are those requirements of for handling cookie consent on the websites and I would say various applications?
Right. So I think the core engine of CMS, right, is basically your is the UI, the UI UX. You basically give the user or the data principal, and then there is the in the backend basically a lot of um, invisible enforceable measures that are taken, right? So I'll break this down into two parts. One is your UX that the customer basically sees from a dashboard, from a preference center perspective, and everything that basically happens in the backend, right? So I mean, the example that you took, right, from a cookie perspective. So this is the first interaction a website visitor will basically have with the website, right? And from a cookie perspective, we've already implemented this in some large organizations. And again, this is very much different from your GDPR, where you basically have to have 22 regional languages, right? Cookie policy just in time to be delivered. And cookies should be basically broken down into like essential cookies, which is like, for example, like your shopping cart persistent cookies or your functional cookies, right? And then there comes the non-essential cookies, which are your analytical cookies or your marketing cookies, right? And you basically have to give your customer a cookie banner, right? Which will have a clear link to a preference center where he will be able to choose, first define what a functional cookie is, uh, which are essential cookies, non-essential cookies like your marketing and analytics, and define them and then give them a very clear toggle, right? And the toggle also has to be basically, it cannot be check marked before, right? You have to let the user do it themselves, right? Yeah, and once they do that, then all the non-essential cookies will basically be blocked out, right? Based on their preferences.
Right. Yeah. So of course, this cookie consent and all of that is much different than GDPR. I absolutely agree. And it's gone into a lot of detail, minute, as small as you said, the toggle button cannot be auto or default tick mark or auto select. It has to be done by
Right.
a user. Absolutely. So just
And
to
the
continue with,
meaty, sorry,
yeah.
sorry to cut
No,
you off, but the meaty also, the meaty also is basically come up with that Bhashini um, platform, which basically does a lot of translation for the 22 regional languages, right? So there's like some integrations that the CMS for cookie banner will have does with the Bhashini app as well to record those as well.
yes, that's right. So I think yes, they've done a quite detailed work. So which is and especially with consent. So while we talk about this cookie consent, but I'm sure you just pointed out about UI UX or the visibility. So while we talk about the visibility, there's something around dashboards, the user dashboards, or the functionalities of the data principle. So there are certain rules which are roles which are defined. I'm sorry. So roles are defined by CMS around user dashboard and functionalities which should be provided to a data principal. So what are those parameters which are there in the CMS?
So from a dashboard perspective, it is basically to view the data principal should basically have, from the dashboard, they should be able to view what consent that they have given. They should be able to modify the consent that they have given, or also revoke consent, right? If they wish to basically revoke the consent, right? It should, in addition to all these aspects, it should also give other pointers like your transaction logs, right? Like what kind of consent have they given, and that should have like a timestamp, consent purposes, and also the important point is that it has to be tied down to a privacy policy version, right? Um,
Okay.
and it should also, it's very clearly defined, right, in the BRD that toggles and channels should also be given in the dashboard itself. And when any change is made, right, the data principal makes that change, a notification should immediately be given to the data principal itself, right?
Okay. So I think what I
So
understand is,
the
yeah,
dashboard itself will also give you a notification of confirmation after you have made any change, right, in your consent.
right. So I think it's so that's why I was saying like DPDP Act, though it has talked about a lot of aspects, but I think this BRD document has given very crisp or quite detailed guideline where you understand that what needs to be covered, how it needs to be covered, what needs to be showcased, what kind of
Correct.
notifications has to go, which is going to be very user friendly, or which is going to help a lot of organization to have a clear visibility on what they're supposed to do. So while all of this is in place, I'm sure everything will have sometimes certain grievances. People may have certain issues while following this. Some issues might come up. So, what does CMS talk about these functionalities, and how does it talk about grievance redressal mechanism for these data principles?
Right. So it the grievance redressal, again, it goes into a lot of detail in the BRD document itself, right? It basically it allows the data principal or customer or employee to basically raise a grievance request and receive an ID immediately, right? Then escalation rules basically have to be defined through workflows so that a DPO and a senior reviewer can basically review it if there has been certain non-compliances. So these rules basically have to be defined, right, for grievance. If basically a grievance ID has been raised and nobody has responded within like 10, 15, whatever the day is, right? It should be auto-escalated within the CMS system, right? The grievance system basically also has to be immutable, right? You cannot basically change because that's a very important aspect, right? Because you have to show the accountability to the regulator in case if somebody wishes to take it to the data protection board. So at that point, the complete immutable audit log has to be basically maintained, and also how the organization has basically responded to those grievances, right? So starting with the grievance reference ID that should be made immediately, and all the audit logs should basically be made of how that grievance is handled.
Okay. Yeah. Quite transparent. So I think this makes the overall system very transparent. So when we talk about, I mean, we talked about compliances, we talked about dashboard, and we talked about a lot of aspects from a functionality point of view. So one important thing which all this leads to is transparency. But when we talk about transparency, and I relate to the BRD document, what comes to my mind is the notifications, because I think that is one of the concept which allows stakeholders to have the transparency. So what is the purpose of the notification module in overall, the document or the in the BRD, and how does it ensure the transparency for all the stakeholders? According to you, I want to understand that.
And so I think it's a very, very important and a valid question that you've raised, right? And notification is something that is usually very, very overlooked in the whole DPDP compliance ecosystem and management, right? So the number one reason why notification is there is basically to ensure communication to all stakeholders, right? So to the data principal, right? A notification, as I mentioned earlier, a notification, uh, the um, the data principal should basically get a notification when they basically make a change when the consent is captured. They should get it via email and via the UI itself. That's for the data principal, right? Also, if the change has been made, then a notification needs to be made to all your processors and downstream, right? Whatever the uh,
Yeah.
the request may be like, right, to basically stop like processing, and it should be logged. It should be queued until the processor basically has given a confirmation that they have received the notification, right? So that's the second part. And the third part is basically for your regulator, right? Notification to the regulator, and those are SLA defined in the BRD document as well, right? So just to summarize what I said, notification is a very important aspect, which is usually overlooked, broken down into three parts. One is your data principal, when the consent is captured, and when the consent is changed, it should come via email or via UI confirmation. Then is your processors and also your downstream systems, right? Like your marketing campaigns that are running on. If somebody says that if a consent has been changed, that I don't want to receive marketing emails, that notification needs to go to the downstream systems as well, and acknowledgement is required. So it's pretty complex in that way.
Okay. Yeah, I think when I learned about DPDP Act, I felt that this is the most exhaustive thing, because I've also gone through a couple of things, in whether it's GDPR or any other laws around the different countries and regions. I think DPDP has been quite exhaustive. Top of it, I think they've added this BRD, which made it much more detailed and complex to understand. But I think when we actually implement it, it becomes simplified system if you really start implementing it. So NEGD has made CMS very exhaustive and loaded with functionalities, which
Right.
is helping people to our audience to understand a lot about the objective, why it exists, and the document, which is created for CMS is going to help, set up the entire consent management quite well. So when we talk about all of this, this has helped us understand, or the audience understand, the functionalities as well in detail as to how this document is talking about each functionality to the core. So let's move, I think, towards the governance and the accountability. While everything is getting implemented, there are a few questions I'm sure our audience would also have about the CMS in terms of ensuring long-term compliances, trust, accountability through various policies and audit mechanism. So there will be audit mechanism which you were talking about. So I think coming to that, what is the purpose of data retention policies and how do you think these are managed within the CMS?
Right. So I think, great. And since you brought up accountability, I will just like to close your previous questions for notification, right? Where there's a accountability and audit and governance aspect in that notification as well. So basically, all the notifications should have like a message ID, who the recipient is, what channel, timestamp, and a payload purpose ID. All these, I don't think I'm missing anything if I am, but there are these specific criteria that have been given from an audit trail perspective for notifications as well. Right.
Okay.
So since you brought up accountability for the next question, I said let me
Yes.
polish that off for the previous question that we spoke about, right?
So you'd
So
like to
basically,
talk about anything on data retention policy? We just want to hear a bit about it.
so from a data retention perspective, right? I mean, data should not be uh, retained more than the specified period, right, of the purpose. Once the purpose has basically exhausted, then you have to basically delete the data, right? A definition of rules for each and every purpose. You should define retention rules for each and every purpose in the system itself, right? So this is not some like a high level stuff, but basically you need to define the rules for each and every data element and the purpose that you're basically using them for. Then you have to define the triggers for deletion, right? I think I had mentioned account
Yes.
closure, or if the purpose is complete. I mean, I applied for something and the purpose is complete, so you need to basically delete it. Or from 3 years, if I haven't interacted with the client with the customer for 3 years, then again, there a data deletion trigger should basically be enforced right there, right? And
Okay.
also implementing secure deletion, from backups as well, which is a very difficult and nuance with any of the privacy regulations, is because how do you delete your data once you know you have to delete it from the backups, right? Because deleting data from the backups, you all know, is a huge challenge.
Okay. Yeah, I
And
think deletion is, or managing that is definitely a data retention or deletion or whatever aspects is a little complex when you talk about data and it's quite sensitive.
yeah,
That needs to be managed.
yeah. And
So
what I
yeah.
understand is that if you basically get a deletion request from one customer, right, and you basically take the backup, right, from the backup, deleting that one specific instance will basically, have a very big repercussion on the complete data that you have basically stored, right? So
Yes.
so that is very important. And then there is also a very big governance aspect, right, for retention as well, right? Role-based access has to basically be enforced, like who has that permission within the organization. DPO should have access to all audit logs as well, right? Support function will have minimal kind of access to do their job, and yeah, and basically any changes that you're making has to be by the admin, has to basically be logged. So it's all about
Okay.
transparency, trust, right? I mean, it just boils down
Yeah,
to these things.
that's what I think we were discussing on, a lot of transparency, trust. And since you talked about a lot of data, audit logs and everything, or logs which are to be created, so the next thing which comes to my mind is so what is the role of immutable audit logs in the CMS, and what metadata do they contain?
Uh, so they contain basically, the consent transaction, the complete records of the consents, right? the enforcement decision that has been taken on those typical consents. And there's a third part, which is your admin. What action has the admin basically taken, right? So all these three have to be logged and they have to be immutable, right? Because tomorrow they have to be used in the court of law. Then there should be leeway for them to be trusted, right? That's why a lot of question comes up that should organizations build their own consent management tool, right? Because I've heard that as well. But the thing is that when there are certain biases basically built into that, right? And how when you're only recording the consent, it usually is the independent party that will have to do that for you. That has more, less biases in them, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
then,
And the whole purpose of transparency
yeah,
is maintained.
yeah. And that, as I mentioned, like you can go into deep depths of like the IP address, timestamp, geolocation, all that basically should be there in the immutable logs, right?
Okay.
The certain aspects, certain elements that I mentioned, right, are some of them are, I think IP address and geolocation are optional, but they're still mentioned. But the other ones, you still need to basically employ for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So while we, talk about this consent management or the PRD, which is prepared for CMS or having clarity on modules and everything, which makes it quite comprehensive, right? Understood. But however, we see that while creating this solution, I'm sure since you have a solution which can focus and cater to this kind of requirement, but what are those some nitty-gritties probably we have missed out talking about, or something which you would like to add on over and above? We talked about the compliances or authenticity or transparency, or we talked about the various modules which are functionally available. So in addition to all of this, anything you would like to just highlight when we want to choose any consent management tool or while implementing consent management in the system?
Right. So I think again a great question. There's a lot of groundwork that's required before you start implementing a system as well, right? Starting with knowing what are the data that you basically have. So I'll put them into two aspects. One is the structured data that you know exactly that you're collecting from your customers, and how is it basically flowing uh, through your whole ecosystem, right? And do you have consent for each one of them? Because what we've also basically seen that data is collected not at a governance level for most of the organization. The marketing team will basically do a campaigning exercise, collect a lot of data, and the data governance and data protection or data privacy team within the organization has no clue about, right?
Yeah.
So first, and that's a pain point that we're getting from most of our customers, right? That basically having that central governance and knowing what data you are collecting from all the customers, right? And this exercise needs to be done from a function wise, right? From a structured data perspective.
Mhm.
Later on, after some maturity, data discovery tools can basically be run to see what kind of unstructured data organizations have collected. But the first step is knowing what data you have collected from your customers and for which of them you require consent, right? As I mentioned, in India, there is the main legal basis of processing data is consent. So you have to take consent for
Yes.
most of them. But that exercise is extremely important, right?
Mhm.
And having that, a data privacy governance committee, which basically talks about, which meets regularly and talks about what data they are collecting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've said it very right, because when you talked about this, I think we are in the same sequence. The next episode, which is going to come up, I'm sure definitely that's something we're going to talk about on data discovery. That's very critical when we have to identify, as you said rightly, you rightly said that we need to know where data is coming from, at least the structure sources that are very well known within the organization. And then while you put in consent management in place, and the next stage where the data discovery definitely can be placed in well, so that all structured, unstructured, wherever the data lies is visible or is known, and we're able to identify and then take further action on it. So
Right.
absolutely, that's right. I think it's been amazing, a lot of inputs from you. I'm sure audience would have had a great clarity on what the CMS wants to talk about. The entire BRD wants to talk about CMS. And the document is definitely a little longer, so people who have not taken effort of reading it fully would have got some idea about it.
Yeah.
So in
And
addition
yeah,
to this, do we want to take up questions or please go on. You're adding
yes, so
something.
a couple of aspects, right? I mean, one is when I spoke about like really mapping out what data basically you have, and organizations obviously will need to start, updating because consent ties very much with your data privacy policy, right? So imagine you'll have to send your updated privacy policy to all your customers, right? And giving them an option that do they wish to basically continue with processing their data, right? And whatever channels they want to. So updating their privacy policy, exactly knowing what are the legal language they basically want to basically putting that in the consent management tool and then filing that up to all your customers on like historical customer data that you've collected as well, right? So this is not only uh, for your new customers, but for your historical consent also, right? Where it becomes a little bit challenging as well. Um, and obviously your vendors, right? The data that you're basically sharing with your vendors has to be updated in the privacy policy, and your data
Yes.
principles needs to be, uh, they have to be kept in the loop with that, right? This moves away a little bit from consent, but this is more from a privacy perspective where you will send them updated privacy policies and take their
Right.
consent. But these
Yeah,
are the
yeah,
aspects that
absolutely.
organizations should start like thinking about, right?
Yeah. Yeah, obviously, see all the modules or we talk about various aspects of DPDP Act, they are quite interlinked. So it's just that we are trying to pick up one and simplify, which is where we're talking about consent management. But some or the other way, obviously, they are connected to each other and they have to support and look back to each other and get
Yeah.
integrated well. So that's for sure, which is needed.
You have to give a privacy with the privacy policy. You have to give them a consent link, right, where they can go and
Yes,
update or
that's
update
right.
or revoke their consent, right? Yeah. So everything is interlinked with.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Great. So, Ibrahim, I think we have a question here I see from Ramanathan. Can you throw some light on the parental consent? Like, how do organizations get parental consent? Like, for example, if there is an online tutorial site or a gaming site, will the child provide parental details, maybe mobile Aadhaar, and then the parent provide consent? How do they ensure that the child is not providing someone else's detail as his parents' data? So, any inputs on that?
I mean, that's fraud, right? I mean, there are two things. This is basically DPDP is. I mean, there has to be a distinction, right? But it's mostly like fraud kind of validation. But if basically a kid has got access to, the parents' DigiLocker or credit card authentication, whatever that medium might be, right? There's still very innovative ways of solving that problem. But the question that they have raised, if I'm understanding it correctly, is mostly from a fraud perspective, where the kid has access to such kind of mechanisms to show that uh, they have their parental consent.
Yeah, absolutely right. There is an individual, care or a responsibility which everybody has to do. So somewhere it start with that and then followed by probably the rules. So it's about wherever possible it's been applied or the guidelines are given. However, it has to be taken care as well. That's
Yeah.
right.
Uh,
Okay.
no, also, yeah, also basically you need parental consent only in areas like if it's for the betterment of the child, then there are some areas that might be exempted, right? Like for insurance companies or what have you. Uh,
Yeah,
so this is
right.
yeah.
That is right. True. Okay, I think we had this one question. We can take a few more questions if anybody has any question. And I think we can anyways also take offline questions. I'm not sure if team is okay. We have something more. Guidelines are strict
There's
on
another
verifying.
question. There's another
Yeah,
question.
sure. You can take it up.
Guidelines are strict on verifying guardian for physically disabled. Any input on how Yeah, I think from that perspective, you will probably have to, uh, and this is more of a legal question, but what I understand is that you will basically need to show uh, uh, court documents that you are the legal guardian for this child, right? Because that cannot happen through digitally as of now. What I understand is that court orders are required for physically challenged and legal guardians, right? For giving that kind of consent. That is the only way that we can do it at the moment. Digitally, I mean, if things evolve, I know that will happen digitally at a future time. But right now, court orders are probably required, right? So maybe you'll have to update court orders or what that case might be to prove that you are the legal guardian, right?
Okay.
Does that answer your question, Alan?
I hope this answers the, yeah, I was about to say, hope this answers the question for Alan. Yes, great. Thank you. Okay, so we can see if we have any more questions from the audience. And we can, I think, not be sure if I'm sure team has circulated something where we can pick up questions otherwise also. Offline people can connect and then send some questions to us.
Sure,
So great. Yeah, I think it's been very interesting. Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for joining us for this insightful session on consent management. And you have helped us decode the BRD's vision in terms of CMS from a consent management or consent collection, dashboard, grievance management mechanism, and immutable logs. I think we've tried to touch upon everything and we've got good insights from your side. So here at CryptoBind also we see the consent as a foundation for digital trust. As you clearly mentioned, it starts with consent and it's very, very critical. So we have to look at that. And we hope this discussion helps people and our audience build compliance ready and transparent systems in line with the BRD, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
The
Okay.
magic word is to get started now, right? Because these things take time, right? And my experience with GDPR implementation also was that Europe has had a lot of privacy related regulations for about 15, 20 years before GDPR came in, and they still had 2 years and they still struggled. Trust me, like, I mean, I was there in Doha, Qatar as a DPO back in 2017, and it was a lot involved. And India has never had a data privacy act, right? In principle, we have had IT Act and what have you, but data privacy is a complete new subject for organizations, right? And it will take a lot of time. I know the government will give some leeway, but I don't think that will be enough, right?
No, but this is for sure. It's clear now that it's happening and it's very good for everybody and it's happening for good.
Yeah, absolutely. Great.
Okay.
Thank you for having
Thank
me
you so
here.
much. Stay tuned, everybody, for next episode. Until then, stay safe. Yeah,
Thank you.
stay secure.
Bye.
Stay secure. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye, Brian. Bye.
Bye.